Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening. Maybe you're watching this during the night. I have no idea. But welcome to this broadcast by Robert Fame podcast. That you just saw that. It's also a Hegelcourses.com broadcast. Just to remind you, there's a website, hegelcourses.wordpress.com, where you can find most of my videos and a lot of blog posts about the philosophy of Hegel. I'm not going to explain to you again why Hegel's philosophy is so important, but it is. And I know of someone who agrees with me on that, and she will be my guest today. And I've opened up myself. I'm stressing my vulnerability now. I've opened up myself to be questioned about Hegel. Imagine. I have to answer questions about Hegel. I have no idea what these questions will be. So again, we're doing a kind of an experiment. Let's say in advance, let me say in advance, if I don't know, I will postpone the answer. But you will find out what I do know and what I don't know. Okay, let's welcome Ivana to our program. Hello, Ivana.
Hello,
Good to
lovely.
see you again. Good to see
Yeah.
you again. Now, I know you have prepared a lot of questions about Hegel. Can you tell me something about the kind of questions you're going to ask?
Well,
Um,
I have
what your purpose
questions
is?
that relate to paragraph of Encyclopedia 554.
Oh, let me
Things
let me get it. Let me get it. Somewhere here behind me, I have the encyclopedia. Let me
uh,
get it.
because
I can prepare a
you
little bit.
some things for granted, and you think it's understandable to somebody who's in just introduced to Hegel, and it isn't. And I have one overarching question that we discussed via email long time ago.
Uh-huh.
But I would like you to talk about difference between stage of religion and religion through intermediary in unhappy consciousness. What's the
Oh my
difference?
God.
Why
Oh my God.
but we can save it for later. What I want you to talk about it, what it is to be that the knowledge of the spirit is uh, overlapping with spirit, so to speak, and what does
Okay.
it mean to be substance for such consciousness?
Well, that's a second question, I hope. I can't do both at the
Substance
same
for
time.
absolute consciousness, because
Oh,
you say substance for consciousness, and
yeah,
it's
yeah.
very
Mhm.
abstract. It's a very abstract concept that substance is also one with the consciousness. So,
Okay,
what do you
but they're two different questions. I would like to treat them as at least
we
as
can
two
write
different
them
questions.
down and treat both
Oh.
of them fairly?
Well, let me start with the question about religion. You're quite right that in the phenomenology of mind, there are many instances where religion comes into play. It is the chapter just before absolute knowledge in the phenomenology, but there are other moments within the phenomenology of spirit where religion is being taken very seriously. And one of them, you're quite right about that, is what is called unhappy consciousness. Now, it's vital, and one of the most difficult things to do, on the other hand, is vital to understand where does a particular chapter, idea, concept, where does it fit in the whole of the system? That is really important. And secondly, what kind of book are we reading? When we're reading the phenomenology, it has a different place and context of its own, and it's also contributing to the whole of the system. It is different. Phenomenology, encyclopedia, the philosophy of history, the special philosophy of religion that we have also, his lectures on that topic, four different ways to talk about religion from different angles, different perspectives. Now, let me start by saying something about religion in the encyclopedia. Encyclopedia has a different method distinct from the phenomenology. The encyclopedia gives us the clear, the clean concepts simply as they are. So it is arranged in a certain order. Every time we have a concept, we have to ask, how is this coming forth from the previous concept and how will it lead to the next concept? But this transition is not given in the encyclopedia. So Hegel just orders all these various concepts in a specific order, and that's it. The phenomenology, however, just like many other books, like the philosophy of religion, like the logic, all of that, they do give the transition. So here you see Hegel's method um, in its fullest form. So, what about unhappy consciousness? What does it have to do with religion? Question number one: where does it fit into the phenomenology, that particular system on its own? And where does that chapter fit into the whole of the system? Okay. So what is the phenomenology? It's the analysis of how consciousness, which always is a relationship between a subject and an object, that's how consciousness is defined in the phenomenology, how it develops simply by breaking down, by not being able um, to continue to persist in a particular way of looking at the world and itself. And consciousness being a relationship expresses itself, and that expression can be adequate or inadequate, it can be partial. And Hegel's contention is that only the concept of absolute knowledge at the end of the phenomenology is totally adequate to what consciousness actually is and what its object actually means. So we are looking at the part of this development. We just had a chapter on consciousness, that is a type of thinking, of understanding, where we try just to focus on the object. We sort of forget about the characteristics of the subjective element of consciousness, but totally focus on the object. Hegel shows that um, it can be what's the word for that? You can't keep just that. You can't stay there. You have
It's
to
not
move on.
sustainable.
Not sustainable. Yeah, that would be a nice modern word for it. Can't sustain it. So we get to the chapter on self-consciousness, the B chapter. Unhappy consciousness is the final part of that second great chapter, talking about skepticism, stoicism, and unhappy consciousness. Or the other way around, stoicism, skepticism, and unhappy consciousness. What is going on there? The whole chapter is about the freedom of self-consciousness. Self-consciousness is still, as a consciousness, totally bound up, totally absorbed by its object. But it has discovered that it has an identity of its own, that it has a self. But it also has a world of objectivity, of objects. Now, how can we understand how, on the one hand, our consciousness is determined by its object, let's say the physical world around us, but is also free? It's in identity with itself. It is a unity distinct from that world of objects. After all, consciousness is a relationship between
Are you
subject and
talking about
object.
Fichte or about Hegel?
Now I'm talking about Hegel.
Yeah,
Now you know where
I
Husserl got
know,
it
I
from.
know, but I'm joking. You could explain um, uh, how at some point in the development of absolute spirit, Hegel is explaining the objective world as opposing to consciousness, and how Fichte did that.
We would go into a very difficult terrain, because it's difficult enough to explain Hegel. It's difficult enough to explain Fichte and their relationship. That would take yeah, too
Hours.
many hours, too many hours. Let's focus on Hegel. Let's focus on, let's say, his question in the second chapter of the Phenomenology. What does it mean when we say that self consciousness is free? as self-consciousness, with the emphasis on self, as an identity with itself. Indeed, that is the terrain of Fichte's philosophy, but then leave him out, just like Hegel did, actually. Let's talk about self-consciousness, totally absorbed by the objective world. And the first way to explain that is with this wonderful imagery of the lord and the slave, the master and the bondsman, something like that. So you have a relationship here. Two forms of consciousness that are in some way alienated from each other. They are other to the other, and the other consciousness is other to myself. If I stress the freedom of self consciousness, I must express this like lordship. What is lordship? Lordship is the fact that consciousness, in every single one of its connections to the world, is actually enjoying himself. My identity is always that, let's say, the basis of my enjoyment of myself. And the objective world is part of my consciousness, somehow given to me in order to consume and to delight in and to understand it and to enjoy it. But as far as I'm simply a free self consciousness resting on my own, I have no idea where these objects come from. I didn't create them, but they were given to me by the other part of my consciousness, which is alien to lordship, doesn't understand exactly how that works. The other part of my consciousness is like a laborer. It has Arbeit. Um, it changes the raw material of my senses into something that the Lord can understand and enjoy. That's the function of this laboring element in my consciousness, in this self consciousness. So the Lord is being given the objective world already transformed into um, uh, contents that it can enjoy. Now,
So
there is a struggle between the two.
The Lord is not aware of the labor of the bondsman.
Well, aware would mean that the Lord is some specific person that can be aware of something or not. But it's like my consciousness is divided over these two functions, and I go from one to the other. I'm looking at something. Let's say I'm looking at an apple, and my bondsman consciousness, this element of my consciousness, sees that and appreciates it, and it loses the individuality of that experience. It's no longer that single experience of that single object. It presents to the other side of me as if it were coming from um, somewhere else. It gives me the content, an apple that I can eat. That's a transformation, because the particular apple with its particular properties that the bondsman, the slavish consciousness, sees before it, it now turns into an apple, that is to say, a specimen of a specific species, with additionally the contents, the characteristics that can be eaten. So there is part of my consciousness that is, when I exercise it, when I simply affirm my own identity, I'm not aware of this slavish consciousness. And when I'm acting within the slave consciousness, I'm not aware that ultimately there is an I, an ego ruling over the whole relationship. I jump from one to the other. And that is the result of what we then have seen before in
How
the.
does that relate to unhappy consciousness?
Yeah, I'm getting there.
Mhm.
Um, Now, what about trying to unify the Lord and the slave? There are two steps here. First of all, Stoic consciousness. That's the Lord who understands that he is connected to the world somehow, but he distinguishes himself from that world, and he only occupies himself with himself. That's Stoic consciousness. The outside world doesn't hurt me, is not important for me. I should be as apart from that outer world as possible. That's Stoic consciousness. Just a peaceful, relaxed enjoyment of myself. But then there is the skeptic consciousness that is suddenly very active, and it tries to um, negate the outer world. It says all these assumptions about what the world is like and all these statements about the characteristics of the world. I can doubt it. It feels the negative power of the self, the ability to negate everything. That's where we are when we start um, unhappy consciousness. What is the outcome of these previous steps? Three steps: Lord and slave, Stoic consciousness, skeptic consciousness. Self-consciousness goes through these transformations, and ultimately it finds itself totally divided within itself. It knows something about the absolute object, um, the only kind of object that is worth my attention. It's outside of me. At the same time, it understands then that self consciousness itself is not the absolute, it's very relative and finite. And it understands to some degree that there must be a consciousness that combines the two, that combines the consciousness of the absolute with the consciousness of myself as finite. Now, that is medieval religion. That's the idea that the absolute, the divine, is like a separate religious realm where everything is perfect, where there is a God who judges me. There are the saints who have, let's say, met all the demands. And opposite to that perfect world stands myself. I am over here, finite, longing to be one with that world, longing to be a part of that divine perfection. And at the same time, very much aware that I can't, I'm finite. That sort of is typical for medieval religion. I'm guilty, I'm filthy, I'm a sinner, I don't make it. I need some intervening consciousness to get me there. That's the consciousness of the priest. That's why it's medieval. Only through the mediation of the priest can I be in some kind of conformity with this wonderful absolute world. Now, Hegel contends that actually these three moments, finite consciousness, mediating priest, absolute divine world, that together they form also one consciousness. I am conscious of the fact that I am finite, that I need the priest, and that I'm aiming for something that I can never achieve or, um, let's say, go there on my own, and that is this absolute divine world. Now Hegel says, what is this self-consciousness? It's a self-consciousness that approaches his object not by thinking and not by understanding, but what he calls Andacht. Andacht is thinking about something, thinking towards something, but it's also piety. He discusses piety as Andacht in the sense of a reference for what is beyond you, without understanding that there is no such thing as what is beyond my consciousness. Because if I'm conscious of what is beyond me, that beyond me is also within me. It's within me because it's a thing that I think of in my consciousness. Hegel argues that there is a hidden unity that combines all these three: consciousness of the absolute, consciousness of the mediation between finite and absolute consciousness, and my finite consciousness. They are actually one consciousness mediating itself with itself. And by some
What do you
really,
mean? Can you elaborate mediating itself uh, by itself? How? All three, four, all three elements are mediating itself by itself. Who is mediating?
my consciousness is mediating within myself, but my consciousness is not expressing that mediation.
Okay, so
So
the
we
main.
can figure it out, but that consciousness hasn't figured it out yet. That's one of the weirdest elements of the whole phenomenology. There is an onlooker, there's a philosophical onlooker that sees this development and notices moments of transition and movement that are hidden from the view of that consciousness itself. Medieval consciousness has all these elements that belong together and, according to Hegel, are actually modalities of one and the same consciousness. I'm not conscious of the absolute beyond me, though I am that absolute. Otherwise, I could not be conscious of it. I'm aware that there is a mediating function here, the priest. But if I'm not myself the priest, by the way, typically Protestant argument against Catholicism, if I'm not that
I was
priest.
just about to ask you if that can be used to criticize Catholicism. Um,
Oh, sure.
as, as
But,
somebody
well,
coming from a
criticize.
country with a Catholic tradition, I'm pretty sure that um, uh, Hegel, as Protestant thinker, it's difficult for a lot of people to conceive that that's what he is.
He's maybe not criticizing Catholicism, but he is criticizing uh, great medieval positions toward the understanding of God.
So
He
he
said,
doesn't think that Catholics stay there. That's
no, I mean, Catholicism obviously developed also after the Middle Ages. So he's not pointing towards Catholicism as such. Um, and he would also, some stages, he will criticize Protestantism for remaining in this same kind of unhappy state. So it's really about something that is peculiar to the Middle Ages, but not confined to Catholicism. It's a very general religious attitude that you, let's say, you project the absolute in some external transcendent realm, but you forget that you are doing the projection, and without you um, affirming that the essence of consciousness, the essence of being human, is a connection with the absolute would have no meaning for you. But if I'm able to posit the absolute like that, am I really that different from the absolute? Is not my finite consciousness actually doing something which in the result I take for infinite, but it's actually the action of my finite consciousness? Or the other way around. If I can do that as finite consciousness, maybe I'm not just finite consciousness. Maybe there is an infinite element here. And Hegel says all of that is not really understood, but it is expressed in forms of piety. I make myself low. I make something else transcend me. I'm doing that. And as soon as I become aware of that, my whole consciousness transforms. And that's the next part, of course, the third chapter, where Hegel says, well, this relationship of between finite and infinite consciousness with the overarching consciousness that understands that whole relationship to be just one consciousness, um, that thing, that structure that we have is actually what we call reason. Vernunft. That is what Vernunft actually is. So reason is always these higher principles, these universals, these absolute categories, and an acceptance and affirmation of consciousness trying to understand the world with the aid of these universals and transcendent categories. But in the application of reason, it's very conscious that I'm doing that. I'm applying reason, so I'm not distinct from it. But I have to apply reason, so I am distinct from it. I'm not the reason or reasonability as such. I'm just a
so.
finite subject applying.
When it comes to reason, does he mention Kant? I mean, he always mentions Kant, but
Only implicitly in the whole phenomenology. If you want to learn how Hegel sees all of these structures return or active in previous philosophies, you have to read the history of philosophy. And my contention was always that the lordship and bondage chapter, that passage, actually talked about Kant, and indirectly also about Fichte, but mainly about Kant, because in Kant's system there is this distinction between what he calls the transcendental apperception, and that is this self-consciousness as unity that is applied to everything else that is in my consciousness. So that is like the Lord, transcendental apperception, the unity of self-consciousness, being applied to bondage. That is my empirical consciousness with all the impressions I have on my different senses. So I always assumed that that part of the whole chapter is actually specifically calm.
So, how does this relate to philosophy of religion and the absolute spirit?
Okay, let's go there.
You made a fantastic insight in very plain language, and I can congratulate you on that because I think it's clear.
I did my best.
You did it very good in a very good way in a very plain language, and it's definitely recording you should leave because it might be very useful to a lot of people
Okay.
because you don't get it so often. But how does it relate to religion, where the spirit knows itself?
Well, when we then jump to the encyclopedia, we have these three shapes of absolute
Mm.
spirit, and religion is one of them. I'm jumping now from the phenomenology to the encyclopedia. Maybe that is not a good idea because religion is also a specific form of consciousness, of course, within the phenomenology. So their religion as such is being treated. But if we jump to the encyclopedia, you see elements of unhappy consciousness, religion as consciousness return. But remember, the encyclopedia gives us the main categories without talking about a transition. So, what is spirit? Spirit ultimately is um, the reality of everything as it relates to itself as consciousness, as understanding, or as knowing. Um, that's, by the way, indirectly an answer to your second question, this difference between substance and spirit. So, when we talk about the whole of reality, without referring to this relationship of the absolute reality to itself, we talk about that reality merely as substance. That's what substance is, what is in and with itself without being for itself. The subject is being for itself. Now, if we can understand the whole of the substance as subject, it becomes in itself, with itself, for itself. That's spirit. So, substance that is, let's say, not posited as something different than my subjectivity, but is shown to be, that's important, shown, demonstrated to be identical to subjectivity. So the absolute spirit knowing itself, or the absolute substance having a self awareness, i.e., God, then we have the full object of philosophy, the reality that knows itself. That's spirit. If we only talk about it in an objective
I
manner,
just
which
want to stress what
unhappy
you said,
consciousness does,
the reality that knows itself. That I think that is the best way to say it for somebody who's completely new to Hegel.
mhm.
I, I read some, but from my standpoint, from someone who is still learning and remembers how I took first steps learning, I think reality that knows itself is the best way to express it. I don't know how does it fit or how simplified it is, but I want to stress it.
Well, it's certainly simplified. But Hegel does the same. He also has simplifications, like in the Vorrede, the introductory session to the phenomenology. Um, he talks about his own project in more or less external way, by saying what it is all about. Substanz muss Geist werden. So substance must be demonstrated to be spirit. Well, what does that mean? In itself and on its own, it doesn't mean a thing. It's more like a deepity. But if you see the whole development in the phenomenology, then you think to yourself, yeah, of course, absolute knowledge must be absolute substance, absolute reality, or absolute reality cannot exclude from itself the reality of knowledge, because then it wouldn't be absolute anymore. It's his criticism of Spinoza. If we want to talk about the absolute,
Can
then
you discuss
must be.
a little bit? I would love to stop you to discuss a little bit the criticism of Spinoza because I think people are going to be able to use it later.
But we
If
were
you,
still talking about religion.
yeah.
So,
Okay, I will drive you back to enforce you.
okay. So let's keep in mind that we want to talk about this other question, but let's first finish then the matter of religion. Um, so, religion is the way in which, in a group of people, let me try to simplify this as well, in a group of people, what he calls the Gemeinde or the church, a congregation, a group of people having the same aim, that is to focus on and to put oneself in relationship with the absolute. But the absolute is still what Hegel would call a Vorgestaltes. That is something that is depicted, it's like an image. And the Trinity is like an image, is not yet a concept. But he sees in religion a form of knowledge that is moving toward, especially in Protestantism, is moving toward a spiritual understanding of the spirit. But that includes in religion, interestingly enough, it includes a congregation or, let's say, a community that focuses on the same. Which is interesting because then, of course, philosophy, which is the third and final section of the encyclopedia, can also be understood as a communal effort, a group of people trying to figure out the truth and everything. It's not just a monologue, but it's a dialogue with others as well. But that's a little bit beside the point.
But
So the fullness of religion and unhappy consciousness uh, don't have really in common the religious aspect. Unhappy consciousness is not yet reason, and that reason has not yet been understood as part of social reality, and that social reality
still
has not yet been understood as
at the
religious.
social reality and objective spirit, how is that different than externalizing spirit in religion and in objective spirit?
In religion, the absolute is understood up to a point. What is wrong with religion still is that this relationship with the absolute is still considered to be a relationship between two things that are external to each other. So the externality of religion has not yet been lifted. But in unhappy consciousness, it's not even clear that we are talking about one and the same form of the spirit. It's not a form, an identical form of the spirit, because it falls apart in three elements: the finite consciousness, the priest, and the world of full divine happiness and all of that. But unhappy consciousness at least shows us what you might call the pain of human consciousness, the pain of this desire to be fully itself, to be fully in harmony with the whole of reality. Um, and it hurts. Unhappy consciousness hurts. And it doesn't completely die out. I mean, even in religion, the need for and the search for this correct relationship with the absolute is still an element of unhappy consciousness, also in Protestant thinking. I think about Protestantism that really emphasizes the guilt and the blame and the sinfulness of human beings. So they're creating a gap. Think of Catholicism, in which indeed the mediation by the church and by the priest is an important element of that relationship. for Hegel, all of that stands for the unhappiness, the impossibility to enjoy your unity with the absolute. Because that is what religion is preparing, and what, to some extent, it's also expressing. The bliss of being redeemed, the bliss of being one with God and the universe, of being accepted, of being loved unconditionally, all of that, which is part of the Protestant way of thinking, happens in the ultimate religion. But there are elements of religion that haven't reached that point yet. And so Hegel will talk about Islam and Judaism as, to some degree, unhappy consciousness, because can't um, you can't meet the demands. Allah and the Lord in Judaism, they demand something that you cannot achieve. And in Hegel's thinking, that is an element of unhappy consciousness. And in Hegel's thinking, Protestantism that preaches absolute grace, we are saved by grace, not by works. Um, for Hegel, that is the ultimate form of religion. That everything that you are, and also the completion and perfection that you need, is given to you. Now, that is exactly, let's say, the abundance and the care and the gracefulness of the spirit, and the spirit is actually active